much longer days.
Some they were pretty. I don't know, I was wore out the first time out. By Friday, I was shot.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like with the Napolitano scores before he unfortunately had to leave down. That's horrible.
What exactly happened? I knew that.
I guess his father passed away.
Yeah, I heard something.
That's terrible. Yeah, it really is. But I mean, it was just so fast paced, you know.
Right.
Yeah, really.
Yeah, even in I give talks on issues, I always have I just keep telling stories. And I know a lot. I could talk about the 160 years of history of the humans.
What sources are there out there? I wanted to really get a true understanding for the topic.
Lots of economics. Oil, gas industry. Robert Bradley wrote this. Murray Rothbard. It's called Oil, Gas, and Government. Robert Bradley, B-R-D-L-E-Y.
Yes, sir.
1996. It's 2 big volumes. I have no idea. It's got 1,500 pages. And it's
well, the big issue with Joe
chock full of information, plus ideological.
they get sucked into the engine.
No.
This is one that gets.
I don't think it's really awesome.
Now, most of them are just
And this is one that gets thrown in my face quite a bit. You know, people
Where you from?
claim Naples, Florida, but just talking with people. I go to a public university, so
At my school, I gave a talk last fall. They don't like me. A lot of them don't like me.
right. Yeah, the biggest claim that I hear as well. You know, there's so much regulation in it now, and it's still not running properly. You know, because obviously.
It's not running from
Right, exactly.
the fracking is well, claims against fracking. That's not my issue today.
Right. Where do you start just fundamentally with somebody who has very limited knowledge? You know, a topic like this, it's kind of tough. You know, you can't just throw them a corner Facebook and say, here you go.
Yeah.
It's tough.
Come to this meeting, just be here. Just understanding our analysis about external Charles Todd.
it's not their fault.
All right, with that, I'll start, I guess. I'm Mark Branley. The title of my talk is Oil Controls, Taxes, and Regulations. It's a pleasure to be speaking at Mises University. I first attended Mises University in 1991, and some of the same instructors were there that are still. Dr. Block was there, and Roger Garrison, and Dr. Herbner, and Murray Rothbard was the feature attraction. And it was a great week, and I trust that you're also having a great week here. At the time when I first attended my first Mises University, I was working in the oil field. Here's a picture of an oil. This is a pumping unit in the oil well in the oil field. I was in the oil industry. You probably can't see that, but this is the Austrian economist's favorite pumping unit. It's a Liberty pumping unit. So. If I go back into the oil industry, I'm going to buy Liberty pumping units for the psychic profit. But I grew up in the oil industry and did all sorts of menial labor in the oil industry, the worst jobs, and then I ended up managing oil production and drilling operations by the time I was done. So why should we even consider the oil industry at this particular conference? First of all, the oil industry has been a critical component of our economy for the last 160 years. So it's worthy of study for that reason. I'll explain a little more about that in a second. And I think there are Austrian lessons to be learned from this industry. I think there are vivid examples of the conclusions of Austrian theory in the oil and gas industry. And I'll get to a few of those conclusions today. So you're probably aware that the oil industry is heavily criticized because of the fossil fuels debate. In a recent survey, 5 of the 10 most criticized firms in the U.S. were oil firms, and this survey goes back to 2010, and that's the case every year. The survey is dominated by oil firms as being the most criticized firms in the industry. But after listening to Tom Woods' lecture on Sunday night, I don't think that should be our position on the oil industry. I think this should be our position. I think we should be grateful for the contributions the oil and gas industry has made to our well-being over the last century and a half. So what are those benefits of the oil industry? Usually the oil industry defends itself by saying, well, what happened in the past year? They take a snapshot. So for instance, the American Petroleum Institute keeps defending the industry, and here are some numbers put out by the American Petroleum Institute saying that the industry supports over 10 million jobs. This is in 2015, with labor income of over $700 billion and benefits that add up to 7.6% of our gross domestic product. But I think this understates. This doesn't tell the full story. The historical story tells us that without the oil industry, we would be in great trouble. And that's what, let me mention that for a minute here. So the oil industry in the U.S. goes back to this Drake well, drilled in 1859 near Titusville, Pennsylvania. They drilled to a depth of 69.5 feet, and they were just ready to give up. Actually, the order had been given to stop drilling, and they discovered oil, and this led to an oil boom in the area at the time. What was happening is we were using whale oil to light oil lamps and for other purposes, and there was an increased demand for whale oil and a declining whale population, so the price of whale oil was going up, and this clever inventor invented kerosene. There was just oil seeping out of the ground, and he realized he could convert this oil to kerosene and replace whale oil. So this led to a demand for more oil and led to exploration such as this Drake well. And the expansion of the oil industry led to, right after this, due to the increase in oil supplies and the increase in kerosene, you could buy a gallon of kerosene at that time for about 10 to 25 cents a gallon, and whale oil cost $5 a gallon. So there was just a tremendous explosion in the use of petroleum in because it was so much cheaper than whale oil. And then at the time, they were producing kerosene. I better not get too far off track. At the time, they were producing kerosene, and a byproduct of kerosene is gasoline. And they were just burning the gasoline. They were just dumping it into pits and wasting it because we hadn't invented and developed the internal combustion engine yet and use this for gasoline. So, but anyway, at this site today, this is Edwin Drake, Colonel Drake on the left here. He wasn't really a colonel, he just used the name for status, but it's Colonel Drake there, and this is a tourist attraction now, and there's a plaque at the tourist attraction, and at the end of the plaque it says, "A series of revolutionary technological changes, unforeseen even by the most prophetic, followed the drilling of this well. An emerging source of concentrated energy and abundant chemical compounds, petroleum supported sweeping changes in our modes of illumination, power development, transportation, and industrial chemistry. Few events in history have so transformed the face of civilization." And I second that statement here. For instance, the oil industry has just been a tremendous contributor to our transportation industry, and there's just been tremendous gains. Where would we be if we couldn't transport our goods to far-flung communities? You know, Carmen Dorabat earlier on Monday explained the gains from the division of labor, and those gains increase greatly if you increase the size of the market, and that's what the transportation industry has given us. Right? And the oil industry has been the major contributor to this industry. Excuse me. All right, let me turn to another issue. The Austrian explanation of the importance of the capital entrepreneur can clearly be seen in the oil industry. And again, you've seen a talk on this, a great talk by Peter Klein, and you've heard many quotes this week about the importance of the entrepreneurial role in the economy. I'll give you one more quote by Ludwig von Mises from his Profits and Losses. Mises says, "Profits appear only when there is a maladjustment, a divergence between actual production and production as it should be in order to utilize the available material and mental resources for the best possible satisfaction of the wishes of the public. They are the prize of those who remove this maladjustment." And that's what we've seen time and time again in the oil industry. By the way, I've a question. Why have we seen most of the technological developments in this industry in the U.S.? Why haven't other countries that are full of oil contributed as much to this industry? Most of the drilling technologies.
I was going to say, lots of times they nationalize oil.
It's because property rights. You know, we see this very clearly at this conference, right? The importance of private property rights. So in most countries, the property rights are owned by the government, and these bureaucrats just don't, they're just not innovative. They're just not developing new technologies. But we see a lot of the gains we've seen over the last 160 years come from this country because of the opportunity to earn profits because of the private property rights. All right, let me mention a couple of my favorite entrepreneurs here. Right after the drilling of the Drake well, they developed the idea of fracking, which has been in the news a lot the last decade or so. There was a Civil War Colonel Roberts, and he was a member of the New Jersey Volunteers. And at the Battle of Fredericksburg, he was watching the explosions on the battlefield, and he got the idea of having these explosions underground. If he could create these explosions near the oil zones, the explosions would fracture the oil zones, and this would increase production. So he developed these tubes and got a patent on these tubes, and he would fill the tubes full of gunpowder and lower the tubes down, and it would explode. And he would usually take a percentage of the increased oil as payment. And oil production would increase over 1,000%, and he became a very rich man. So, then he transitioned from gunpowder to nitroglycerin, a very risky proposition, and a very dangerous way to fracture oil wells. But, and then through the 1800s, we were drilling oil wells by simply pounding pipe into the ground like a nail. Very primitive. And then in 1901, starting with the Lucas Gusher at Spindletop in Texas, they developed the technology of rotating the pipe with something sharp at the bottom and just drilling into the ground, which is the method we use today. So this development led to the need for a bunch of new downhole tools. I'll mention another entrepreneur. When you think of Howard Hughes, you're probably thinking of Howard Hughes Jr., but Howard Hughes Sr. developed drill bits and other downhole tools to take advantage of this new drilling technology. And he started Hughes Tool Company, which is still in existence. He bought his first drill bit idea from a guy in a bar for $150 in 1901, which was an awful lot of money then. But and then when he died, Howard Hughes Jr. inherited the company, and that was the foundation of the Hughes financial empire. Let me jump to the modern era here. Another one of my favorites, George Mitchell in Texas, owner of Mitchell Energy. By the 1980s, we realized there was all of these oil zones that were just chock full of oil, but we didn't know how to get it out because they were tight oil formations, such as oil shale. And George Mitchell invested millions and millions of dollars to develop technologies to get this oil out of the ground. And this led to the recent oil revolution. But after he sold his company, one of his employees said 90% of the employees thought he was just crazy and wasting his money. Just millions of dollars down the tubes. But he developed these new technologies, and he was successful. And then he sold Mitchell Energy for $3.1 billion. And that's why we can produce over 10 million barrels a day in this country, is because of George Mitchell's investments here. So there's been an explosion in our ability to produce oil in this century. All right, so those are some of the successful entrepreneurs. Unfortunately, the government has spent 160 years interfering with the entrepreneurial role in this industry. So I'll skip the first 110 years of history, and I'll jump to the famous 1970s here. I trust you've probably heard of this. So here's what happened in the 1970s. From the late 1950s until the early 1970s, the number of wells drilled in the U.S. declined by over 60% a year. Not 60% a year, but a total of there are 60% fewer wells drilled in the early 70s than in the late 50s. There's a wonderful book about this energy crisis in the 1970s put out by William Simon, who was Nixon's energy czar, although he's a fierce critic of what the government was doing at the time. He was the energy czar, and he wrote a great book called A Time for Truth, and Friedrich Hayek wrote the foreword to that book. But in that book, he attributes this decline in U.S. production to 55 different government agencies strangling the oil industry. He uses the verb strangling the oil industry. So the government was strangling the oil industry, leading to this increased dependence on foreign oil. And then in 1971, Richard Nixon imposed phase one price controls, price ceilings, economy-wide, and which didn't affect the oil industry very much at that point. And then in 1973, due to some geopolitical conflict, the Arab countries, with their Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, they limited their oil exports, this oil embargo at the time. And this drove oil prices up from about $2 to $3 a barrel to $12 to $13 a barrel. So now the price controls started having an effect. And then the price kept trending up over the 1970s, and by the late 1970s, the price of oil was about $20 a barrel. And then the Iranians overthrew the Shah of Iran, and this disrupted oil supplies, and the price of oil shot up from $20 a barrel to about $40 a barrel. And throughout this period, there were various price controls in the industry. So I'm only going to address the where were we at by 1979? So by 1979, there was three tiers of oil pricing. So for the old oil, for oil wells that were drilled before the oil embargo, they called it old oil, then the price ceiling was $5.75 a barrel. Because the reasoning was, you drilled the well when the price of oil was $2 to $3 a barrel, so you shouldn't make profits higher than that. Right? And then for wells drilled after the embargo, the price of oil was $12 to $13 a barrel. So for wells drilled after that point, there was a price ceiling of $12.66 a barrel, the new oil. Imported oil had no price ceiling. You could buy oil from Mexico or Russia or wherever at market prices. And then stripper oil, those are oil wells that produce less than 10 barrels a day. There was no ceiling. Because if they put a ceiling on those wells, we would have just plugged all those wells. So there was no ceiling on stripper oil. All right, so what's the problem here? What do price controls do? What do price ceilings do? So we all probably immediately think, well, price ceilings cause shortages. But there really wasn't shortages, because you could buy as much oil as you wanted if you were willing to pay the higher price. So there, in a sense, there weren't shortages. But there were huge problems. They're widely recognized. Government officials even recognized it at the time. The problem was basically that the government was trying to achieve two ends. One, they were trying to reduce their dependence on foreign oil. And two, they were trying to keep the average price of oil down in order to generate a lower price for gasoline. So they were thinking with the price controls, the average price of oil would be less, and therefore refineries would charge lower prices for gasoline, right? Because their input cost would be less. The problem is those two goals conflict, which is why Jimmy Carter eventually abolished the price controls. And we all see this negative impact on oil production due to these price controls. You're less likely to drill new oil wells if you can sell the oil for $12.66 a barrel than if you can sell it for $40 a barrel. So people wanted to own oil rights, but they didn't necessarily want to drill any wells. So the price of oil rights skyrocketed. People wanted to own oil, but they didn't necessarily want to drill wells for that oil, because the price was a third of the market price for oil by 1979. So, all right, everybody recognizes this point. There's another point people tend to not recognize as easily, and that's this misallocation of resources. So the entrepreneurs were engaged in economic calculation, maximizing their profits, using the prices that were available, but those prices aren't set by because there was private property. Those prices were controlled by the government. So it's creating very odd investment decisions. Firms are making investments. They're using their resources to try to figure out how to get the higher priced oil instead of the lower priced oil. And I have lots of stories about these, but I don't really have time to tell you about them. But it's just obvious. If I can sell a barrel of oil here for $5.75 and it costs me $7 of resources to get it out of the ground, I don't make that investment. But if I can get a barrel of oil out of the ground here for $10 of resources and sell it for $12.66, I will make that investment. So you end up sort of searching for the less efficient oil in a lot of cases. Or if you're producing 15 barrels a day, it's better to just cut your production to 9 barrels a day. And you can then sell your oil. If it's an old oil well, you sell your oil for 6 times the price just by cutting your production. And so there was all sorts of odd things going on here, in addition to some illegal activities. People would just, if they were selling oil here for $5 a barrel, they would just put it in a truck and ship it to where they could sell it for $12 a barrel. It's completely illegal. But all right, due to all the problems with these various price controls, Jimmy Carter pushed for the elimination of these controls. The price controls were phased out over a 2-year period and replaced by the windfall profits tax. a tax that Murray Rothbard describes an excess profits tax as a tax where it's difficult to find a tax more indefensible from more points of view than this one. The windfall profits tax ended up not collecting hardly any revenue because by the time they had imposed it, prices were falling and there were no windfall profits. So for years, we would just fill out the forms. I was involved in the industry, and we would just fill out the forms, and every month we would send in saying we don't owe anything. We would calculate windfall profits, it would be zero. Our tax burden is zero, we mail it in. So after years of this, they finally abolished the windfall profits tax. Let me jump to the current tax situation. The various states impose severance taxes on oil extraction. They're called severance taxes because you're being penalized for severing the oil from the ground. So the idea is you're taking away Alabama's oil forever when you sever it. So there should be a penalty for this because Alabama will never have that barrel of oil again. So these are the basic tax rates here. I hope you can see Alaska has a tax that's 35% of net profits. A very high tax. The other tax rates are much lower. Alabama's tax is 8%. The tax rates range from 4.6% in Texas to 12.5% in Louisiana and Florida. All right, these are not profits taxes. These are taxes that are a percentage of revenues. So if you have to pay 8%, if there's an 8% tax on your oil production, if you extract $100 of oil from the ground, you have to send the state of Alabama $8. So it's not a percentage tax. These are very substantive taxes. The tax rates look relatively low, but these have a huge effect on the oil investment decisions. Let me also say these are the basic tax rates, but a lot of states have some loopholes. Like a lot of states charge half of the tax for the first 90 days of production to get you to, they're trying to give you an incentive to drill in their state. So there are some complicating factors here. All right. So these might look like relatively low rates, but they're not. If you've made an oil investment and you're getting a 15% return on your investment, which is a healthy return, if you have to pay 5% of your revenues to the federal government, they're taking away 38% of your profits. And if you have a small return on your investment of 8%, they're taking away 67.5% of your profits. I mean, a 5% tax has a big, all oil companies, when they're drilling and investing in the oil industry, take the tax into consideration. There are lots of oil investments that are profitable without the tax, but they're not profitable with this tax. All right, everyone recognizes that the tax negatively impacts oil production. There's lots of studies on it. The states that impose these taxes accept this. We know it has a negative effect on oil production. But what else can we say about these taxes? All right. Rothbard's description of tax shifting fits perfectly in this industry. So Rothbard talks about how taxes are shifted backwards onto the factors of production. And we clearly see this in oil because the factors of production are so specific to the industry. Drilling rigs are only good for drilling oil wells. Right? So the factors of production and the capital and much of the labor is specific to the industry. So the taxes decrease the demand for these factors of production, and this leads to lower wages for the workers and lower prices for capital, lower profits for the entrepreneurs. This is just very clear. And this is exactly Rothbard's description when Rothbard says these kind of taxes essentially are income taxes. But there's a more complicated issue here. I have to say the word elasticity a few times here. The demand for each state's oil tax, for any single oil tax, the tax has really no effect on the price of oil. Right? Each state is such a small part of the world market that if you tax production, it doesn't affect production enough to affect the price of oil. In economic terms, the demand is perfectly elastic. That means that the tax has a significant effect on oil production. It has a larger effect on oil production than a similar tax in a situation where demand is inelastic. Trust me on that. All right, so if that's the case, that these oil taxes are, in a sense, not that we think any taxes are efficient, but in a sense they're less efficient. In neoclassical terms, the taxes have a large deadweight loss. So if that's the case, why did the states impose these taxes? Why do they impose these relatively inefficient taxes? And they give us a couple of reasons. All right. So if you taxed, say, Alabama, if you taxed another industry in Alabama, I don't know, if you taxed candy makers in Alabama and took away 8% of their revenues, they would all leave the state and end up in Texas or somewhere. But if you tax the Alabama oil industry at 8%, they can't move to Texas. You have a trapped industry. The supply of oil is elastic, but it's not as elastic as other industries that just leave if you tax them like this. So because they have this trapped industry, they think it's legitimate generally to tax this industry, even though it has a significant effect on the number of jobs in the oil industry. So, all right. And second, the taxes are largely exported. So tax exporting is when one political jurisdiction imposes a tax on people who can't vote for them. Right? One state imposes a tax, and the burden of the tax falls on people outside the state. So the Alaska 35% tax negatively impacts companies, but most of those companies aren't in Alaska. They're in Houston, Texas or somewhere. So the burden of the tax is paid by Texans, and then the Alaska state government gets the revenues. The reason I bring this up is this is a perfect illustration, I think, of the idea that Rothbard and other Austrians talk about their emphasis that in tax situations, we should always be considering that there are taxpayers and tax consumers. This is lost in some public finance textbooks, but Rothbard emphasizes this time and time again. And in oil taxes, you clearly see this. You clearly see that you're imposing taxes, and the taxpayers are in other states to a high degree, and the tax consumers are in your state. And that makes it an attractive. Legislators like to impose taxes on people who can't vote for them. So even though the taxes have a large effect on production, these taxes tend to be popular for state governments. All right, let me move on. There's another issue, a current issue called the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, and here's how this Strategic Petroleum Reserve works. We pump oil out of the ground in various areas of the country. The government takes tax dollars and buys the oil. They ship the oil to Texas and Louisiana, and they pump it back in the ground. And they say, look, if we need it, we'll pump it out again. Right? That's the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. That they take oil out of the ground and pump it back in the ground at 4 sites near the Gulf Coast in Louisiana and Texas. They started this program again in response to the energy crisis of the 70s. The first oil was pumped into the SPR in 1977. The first tens of thousands of barrels of oil was actually oil purchased from Saudi Arabia. Not that it really matters where they buy the oil from, but they bought tens of thousands of barrels of Saudi Arabian oil to start filling up the SPR. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve has a capacity of over 700 barrels. Currently, there's 700 million barrels. Currently, there's less than 700 million barrels in the SPR. And the current value is roughly $50 billion of oil that they're holding on to. President Trump has proposed, he's proposed recently to take some oil out of here to fight oil prices. But earlier, a few months ago, he proposed selling a significant portion of this oil over the next several years for revenue purposes in order to make the oil industry great again. And it has a withdrawal capacity of a little over 4 million barrels of oil. So the federal government now has the ability to, they say, to pull, for a short period of time, to pull 4 billion 4 million barrels of oil a day out of the ground. We produce a little over 10 million barrels of oil in the U.S. daily. And so the idea is we could be producing 10 million barrels of oil that's in private hands, plus an additional 4 million barrels of oil out of the SPR, at least until the oil ran out. So why do I have, it might sound like a sensible policy, or why do I have a problem with the Strategic Petroleum Reserve? The argument for the Strategic Petroleum Reserve is it allows the governments, specifically the president can pretty much do what he wants here, to combat volatile oil prices by pumping oil into the reserve or taking oil out of the reserve. So sometimes they prevent oil prices from falling. So when prices started to fall rather quickly under George Bush, he ordered that the SPR be filled as soon as possible to maintain higher oil prices. He said he wanted to stabilize oil prices. I'm sure it had nothing to do with his connections in the oil industry. So why do I have a problem with that? It's because of my view, and I hope our view, of the entrepreneur, as Peter Klein has described again earlier this week. We know the entrepreneur makes these investment decisions, recombines the factors of production in search of monetary profits in the face of uncertainty. The problem I have here is that some of this entrepreneurial role is taken away from them. Right? So this is the entrepreneurial role, and according to our understanding of markets, the entrepreneur does a good job of allocating resources to consumer wants. The SBR takes some of this entrepreneurial role away from the entrepreneur and puts it in the hand of government officials. And we have little expectation that government officials will make these decisions based on anything other than short-term political considerations. We don't expect them to be attempting to allocate resources to consumer wants in any manner. We expect them to be trying to acquire and hold on to political power. I think there's a further complication here. Entrepreneurs make these decisions in the face of uncertainty, attempting to forecast the future. So if you're making major oil investment decisions, you're thinking about the future price of oil. You're thinking what's going to happen in China, what's going to happen in the Mideast, what's going to happen regarding the supply and demand for oil in the U.S., and now you have this additional complicating factor. You have to think what's going to happen, what's the president going to do about the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. So you've added an additional uncertainty to your calculations. If you were expecting a price spike in the oil industry and you were in this industry, you would make investment decisions where you had oil production available that you could start pumping out of the ground if the price spiked. But now you think to yourself, if the price spikes, the president's going to step in and dampen this price spike and take the profit motive away from me. Right? So you have less of a profit motive to anticipate these price spikes and do something about it because of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. All right, there's another issue that bothers me greatly regarding our oil supplies, regarding the oil industry. And that's the fact that a tremendous amount of oil and gas in the U.S. is not in private hands. The government owns a tremendous amount of oil and natural gas. One of my favorite topics. I call it land socialism. So the government owns a lot of land. Here's a government map indicating the federal land ownership. Of course, the red indicates the government lands here. 81% of Nevada is in federal hands. 66.5% of Utah is owned by the feds. Only 61.8% of Alaska is owned by the federal government, but the state government of Alaska owns 28.8% of Alaska, so 91% of Alaska is in government hands. This map is leaving out the 200 million acres of state-owned lands that the state governments own, which is, that's a lot larger than Texas. Right? The state government lands is bigger than Texas by a significant amount, and that's not on this map. for instance, the state of New York, there's almost no red because the feds own 0.7% of New York, but the state government of New York owns 37% of New York. So I'm leaving out a lot on this map here. The Bureau of Land Management has under its control 248 million acres. If the BLM was a state, it would be 47% bigger than Texas. And the U.S. Forest Service would be 15% bigger than Texas. There's just tremendous land holdings here. The Fish and Wildlife Service is almost as big as Montana. If it was a state, it would be the 5th largest state. It has control of 89 million acres. I should dial it back, huh? All right. So there's a tremendous amount of land ownership here. All right. So I'm skipping a lot of numbers, but the federal and state governments own about 40% of the dry land in the U.S. Here are the numbers that I'm getting from a 2017 congressional report regarding government land ownership. Again, the states own about 200 million acres and the feds own about 695 million acres. I have an asterisk here because if you're reading about this, I'm including the Indian lands. The Bureau of Indian Affairs controls little over 55 million acres of land. And oftentimes, if you read government reports, they leave out the Indian lands. They say the Indian lands are not theirs. That's Indian land under control of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. But regarding oil and gas, the feds control it. So I don't think the Indians think they own that land, by the way. I don't think the Indians are thinking this is my land. But it's clearly, to me, under government control. So I include the 55 million acres of Indian lands in my numbers. I just caution you, because sometimes you see a smaller percentage that leaves out the Indian lands. And the Indian lands are chock full of oil and gas. Again, President Trump has talked about allowing the Indians to own the land in order to further oil exploration, to make a lot of people rich. So, all right, so again, this is the land owned by the federal government. This is the dry land in the 50 states, but that's not the end of the story. 35 years ago, the feds established their claim that the federal government owns all of the lands offshore, underwater, out to 200 nautical miles offshore. That's 230 land miles, everywhere. And they say they own it completely. They own that land, they say, to a greater degree than anything I've ever owned. Right? They own complete right of exclusion, the complete right of sale, the complete right of exploration, everything. This is called the exclusive economic zone, or there's actually multiple zones. And here's a federal map of the U.S. So this other blue area offshore, those are the exclusive economic zones owned by the federal government. I consider this to be a part of the United States, in which case a majority of the United States is underwater. There's a lot more land offshore in the exclusive economic zones than there is land in the 50 states. And the feds say they completely own that 100%, and that they completely control all the resources there. And they own all these little circles of land in the Pacific because some ships stopped at these islands in the Pacific in World War II, and so they claimed ownership around that. So there's one island here that's it's about 500 acres, I think, and it holds 166,000 acres of land in the ocean around it that the feds own. All right, so it's a lot of land. All right, so why do I have problems with this? I have a lot of problems with this land ownership here. One, of course, this just, they're just restricting our economic development by not letting us have these resources. So these numbers are from a 2012 congressional report, and they say that the onshore lands owned by the feds have $31 billion of oil from conventional sources. And those same onshore lands contain 1.23 trillion barrels of oil from non-conventional sources, such as oil shale. And we now have the technology to get to some of this oil from these this trillion barrels from these non-conventional sources, and we're quickly developing the technology to get more of it. We could get a lot of this oil out of the ground if they would let us. 60% of these lands are completely closed. 60% of these lands with oil and gas are completely closed to exploration, and only 8% of the lands are open at all to standard leasing arrangements. 32% of the lands have some leasing available, but there are many, many additional restrictions on that land. The congressional report says there's over 3,000 additional restrictions in these leases. There's over 3,200 additional restrictions in these leases outside of these this 8% of the lands that have standard leasing arrangements. All right, the ocean lands are full of oil and gas and other resources. We know that. There are no good statistics on it because they won't let us go look for it. And there's no one's going to make the investment to try to determine how much oil and gas is out there until they let us drill a few wells and do some things, right? So, since 1983, when they established the exclusive economic zone, the government again and again says these are tremendously valuable land. They're actually probably overstating the value, saying it's full of resources, we own it, we can control things, right? So you just can't trust any of the numbers that are out there. But we know there's lots and lots of oil and gas and other resources on this government land. All right, in addition to this, few people would argue with this. Of course, the government's restricting our production, restricting our ability to get to oil and gas, which is leading to less economic development. If we had those resources, we could build a lot of new things, and a lot of it would, you know, it would provide additional energy for our economy. But there are other issues. Again, similar to the tax problem that I talked about, there's a calculation issue that is less widely recognized here. Rothbard says the allocation of resources in a private enterprise will better satisfy consumer demands, while government enterprise will distort allocations and introduce islands of calculational chaos. And that's what we see in the oil industry. We see islands of calculational chaos time and time again. So, for instance, if you could get this barrel of oil out of the ground for an investment of $20, and this barrel of oil out of the ground for an investment of $35, you would expect to make this investment. Economic calculation tells us that that's what would happen if the resources were in private hands. However, if this oil is not available, you end up spending $35 of resources to get this barrel of oil out of the ground, instead of getting the more efficient oil out of the ground. And this happens time and time again because the government controls such a high percentage of the oil and gas in the country. So the entrepreneurs, again, are engaged in economic calculation appropriately, trying to maximize their money profit. But the calculation is completely distorted. Not only does the government control the price of oil to a large degree by holding these resources, there's distortions in the system. There's another distortion. If you want to, if you buy a federal oil lease that's offshore, for every dollar of oil out of the ground, you have to give the federal government 18.75% royalty on top of the lease purchase. But if you buy an onshore lease from the federal government, you only have to give them a 12.5% royalty. You have to give them 12.5% of your oil revenue from that lease. So even if it was more efficient in the sense of cost to pursue the offshore oil, it's oftentimes more beneficial to invest in this onshore oil because of the 6% royalty difference. So this royalty difference is creating this calculational problem in the oil industry. And all drillers take this into consideration. A 6% difference in revenues is a huge difference in your profits. So these distortions are caused because the government owns such a large percentage of the natural resources here. All right, there's one more issue here. At the end of Power and Market, Rothbard tells us that governments, In their effort to control us generally and control the economy overall, governments will attempt to control the monetary system, they will attempt to control the transportation system, and they will attempt to control the natural resources, the land and the natural resources, the beginning of the structure of production. And he explains if they control this, then they have a great control over other things. And he warns us about this danger, the end of power and market. And I think that's why we should be concerned not only about the government land ownership because of its effect in the oil and gas industry, but we should be concerned about this overall. Rothbard tells us that in almost all countries, governments laid claim to ownership of new unused land. Governments could never own original land on the free market. This act of appropriation by the government sows the seeds for distortion of market allocations when the land goes into use. And as I've described, this is exactly what happens in this industry. I hope that I have provided some examples in the oil and gas industry that correlate with our Austrian theory. Thank you very much. What'd you think? I should just talk about it. I should have given a talk. I have so much to tell you about sand. It's just.
That's more.
If you include the offshore lands, they own 75% of the land.